Good evening, everyone. I'm Carol Olson Day of the New York Times, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's TimesTalks. We're live here at the Times Center in New York, and we're live around the world on the web at nytimes.com/opinion. This week, 100 writers from 25 countries are in New York for the annual PEN World Voices Festival of International Literature, which this year is celebrating the 90th anniversary of PEN American Center. The Sunday Review section of the New York Times invited 3 of those writers from Canada, Britain, and the United States to consider the question of America and its role in the global political culture. And tonight we are delighted to have them here to discuss their work and their perspectives. You'll hear much more about their work and about these distinguished talents from our moderator. If you were to do a search on nytimes.com, you would find out that as chief film critic of the New York Times, he reviews hundreds of movies a year, files in-depth reports from the major festivals, and contributes numerous Critics' Picks videos to the website. But you'd also discover that he writes about ideas and trends for the Sunday Review, culture for the Sunday Magazine, and books for the Book Review. Before joining the Times in 2000, he was a Sunday book reviewer for Newsday and a frequent contributor to Slate and the New York Review of Books. So please join me in welcoming Tony Scott and our special guests, E.L. Doctorow, Margaret Atwood, and Martin Amis.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I could easily spend the next 90 minutes just introducing the 3 people to my left, who I'm sure are familiar to many of you, but just to make the proper introductions, E.L. Doctorow, author of many, many novels, including Ragtime, Homer and Langley, The March, and many others. Margaret Atwood, author of Oryx and Crake, The Blind Assassin, The Handmaid's Tale, and many other novels and essays and other works. And then Martin Amis, whose works include The Pregnant Widow, The Information, Money. I'm sure you all have your favorites from each of them. My own job tonight, I'll be very pleased if I say very little and nothing memorable, and so that we can have a chance to listen to these 3 guests. But I think the place to start, the kind of the net that the New York Times cast that caught them all, was a group of essays that they wrote for the Sunday Review this past Sunday that I imagine many of you have seen, that were sort of about the question, the kind of question that tends to come up here in this country often, every 4 years when we have our elections. What is the nature and the role and the identity of America in the world, and politicians and journalists have their version of an answer to this, but it's always, I think, very good to hear from imaginative writers. So the 3 of them wrote 3 very different and I think extremely rich and suggestive essays, and I thought we could start. If there are people in the audience who haven't read them or read them over coffee and then went out for Bloody Marys and forgot about them on Sunday, to remind, to sort of call those to mind. So, and of course, one of the interesting things about this assignment is only one of the 3 authors is writing from the perspective of an American. The other 2 belong to our let's say, our sister and mother countries in the English language world. So why don't we start with you, Mr. Doctorow, and you could tell us, give us an idea of what you wrote and what kind of thought process the question provoked for you.
Well, I was reflecting on this assignment, and occurred to me that we were becoming a distortion of ourselves over the past 10 or 12 years, beginning with the unfortunate circumstances of the 2000 election, where the Florida count was suspended and the Supreme Court justices appointed George Bush as president, and his administration followed with numerous violations of the Constitution. It is true that he had predecessors in President Nixon and President Reagan, but where they were careless or indifferent to the Constitution, it seems to me he was reckless and blasphemed. If you think of the Constitution as the sort of the sacred document of this society, the covenant was broken. And as with the ancient Hebrews, when you break the covenant, you're in bad trouble. And I think that set off a certain kind of madness in this political life of ours, even though President Obama was elected. And in this piece, I seem to find the arc going through these Supreme Court decisions, where after doing what they did, the really disastrous decision of Citizen United versus the Federal Election Commission, where corporations were seen to be people who had the right to express themselves politically. That is such a weird reading, and a corporation can only act one way. It can't act against its own. A human being can act against his or her own interests, but a corporation can't. And if you're a corporation that makes cigarettes and cigarettes cause lung cancer, you will continue to sell cigarettes. If you're an energy company in the Midwest and you know that your spewings cause acid rain to fall over the lakes and forests of the eastern seaboard, you will do nothing about it. And if you're a multinational corporation, you'll park your profits overseas and avoid U.S. taxes. And it seems to me that, of course, people run corporations, but they're subservient to this categorical imperative a corporation exists to produce wealth. And it also, whatever the individuals, the investors or the workers or the executives think, they will operate for the sake of the corporation to keep their jobs or to save their investments, or in the case of CEOs, they'll keep their pictures on the front covers of business magazines. And it's insane to think that a fiefdom like that would have the privileges of a person's vote. And then the final decision just the other day, it seems, where they ruled that, the conservative majority ruled that it was possible police departments anywhere in the country could strip search anybody for whatever reason they felt necessary. And I think that was really strange. I mean, Joseph K. in the trial, he has a hard time, but nobody asks him to take his clothes off. So that's sort of the arc of the way the piece went, and the idea of losing our, however illusory, the sense of our exceptionalism, I think is no longer, it's no longer sustainable.
Well, that was the theme, and I think the title, at least it was given to it, was unexceptionalism. The idea that whatever distinction we had from other countries in the realm of our politics and of our constitution has been has been undone in the last.
Yeah, we're becoming progressively unexceptional in terms of our secret warrantless searches of people's homes and businesses and records, and our data mining and all the subversions of what we think of as life in the United States. I actually think that we're a house of many mansions. If you're going to bring it down, you bring it down from the top. That's the way houses get brought down. And I think that a lot of damage was done on the roof there.
And how about speaking, well, we can continue that spatial metaphor since you're up above the roof of this mansion, sort of peeking over the southern border. And you brought a very interesting, not just geographical, but interplanetary perspective to the question. So tell us a little bit about what you wrote.
Yes, well,
where
and
it came from.
further to corporations, I don't think you should be allowed to be a person unless you can die. Unless you can die. Then mortality should be the point of entry.
Yeah, that's right.
So corporations don't die. They can get taken over, but they don't die. So
They can merge. They can merge.
That's different. It's a different thing.
That's what they do.
And
They
it's
merge,
different
yeah.
when people merge. That's different from corporations merging.
We're only allowed to write about one of those explicitly in the New York Times.
Only the corporations,
yeah.
yes. Well, and for that reason, I was a bit astonished that I got away with my piece in the New York Times, because it did contain the word uterus, and once upon a time, not have been allowed to print that word in the New York Times. I had a lot of trouble with a review of John Updike's Witches of Eastwick back in the 80s, because it was very hard to review that book without mentioning certain kinds of bodily fluids. But you were not allowed to use those words in the New York Times then. You couldn't say pee. They said, this is a family paper. So we
still
ended up saying,
try to keep it as dry as we can.
we ended up saying bodily fluids, which was actually a lot worse. So this time, what the Times asked was, how does America look from an outsider point of view? How does this culture look? So I brought some outsiders into the piece who happened to be from Mars. And we did vote on our pieces as to which was the silliest, and mine won. Yours was the most serious, and Martin's was in the middle from point of view of silliness. But I did have the Martians look at the United States through a couple of pieces of literature, foundational pieces, two of them by Hawthorne, Young, Goodman, Brown, through which we viewed America's suspicion of the neighbors, namely anybody who happens to live next door to you may be up to satanic practices, as we all know. And the second one was the Maypole of Marymount, which was pleasure and gratification versus stomping on it, which goes right back to the beginning. And then I looked at Moby Dick from the point of view of the Martians, who rightly identified the fact that it's about oil.
Yes.
So it went on from there, and the Martians were warned against going to certain places outside New York City where they might be misunderstood. Confused with, in fact, uteri, which they resembled, and put in jail. So they're not going there. They're going to go to Radio City Music Hall instead.
Well, what about Moby Dick?
Moby Dick, about oil.
Yes, I was interested in their reading of Moby Dick. They're sort of Marxist Martians.
Well, I think I think that's what Moby Dick is in fact about, and I think that Melville designed it very carefully to represent a number of different segments of American society. It wasn't for nothing that he named the ship after an extinct native tribe and put 3 harpooners in there from different parts of the empire and made the owners 2 hypocritical Quakers.
I must admit I disagreed with that interpretation.
What did you think Moby Dick was about?
Well, I think the key thing is the image of Moby Dick, who is a white whale, and he describes it, as I recall, as the absence of color. And Moby Dick is the ineffable, unmanageable universe. And it's not Ahab who's interested in money. He doesn't care about money. It's Starbucks who's interested in money. So I think the whole Martian Marxist idea just collapses.
No. The Quakers who own the ship are interested in money. They're very interested in money.
Yeah, that's true, but
Well, just think of Ahab as a CEO who's gone off the rails. Sometimes do.
But Moby Dick can't stand for good-natured nature. In fact, he disposes what Melville calls harlot's colors over nature. So he's something else. So you can't make him an ecological victim.
Well, but then there's we're going to get into this, I can see. There's the chapter in which all of the whales are described, and then there's the other chapters in which the butchering and boiling of whales are described.
That's absolutely true.
Yeah, so you can't get out of it that way.
No. I'm not so sure.
You've all done the assignment, correct? We'll collect your papers afterwards and grade them. And Martin, your piece was more of a personal recollection of your own youthful encounters with America. And what fascinated me about the three of them is the range not only of approaches and voices, from the sort of the traditional American Jeremiah, if you want, for Edgar's the science fiction kind of speculative whimsy of Margaret's and the sort of personal. You said it was voted the silliest.
Well, that was other people.
Okay. Playfulness. Can I say playfulness? It was playful. It was serious, but yours was in a vein of kind of personal recollection, and also touched on a key element of the American experience from inside or out, which is race.
Yeah, as we agree, my piece was quite silly, but it had a serious ending, a serious subject. Begins describing, with a description of my brother and me coming to America aged 9 and 10, and we'd taken the precaution of changing our names before we left Swansea in South Wales. I was going to be Marty, and my brother had adapted, they're brilliant this, I think, for a 10-year-old, had adapted one of his middle names and rechristened himself Nick Jr., while ignoring the fact that there was no Nick Sr. So we were completely prepared when we sailed into New York Harbor. I then said that Wales at that time, it had Celtiberians, but I was already smoking cigarettes and stealing money out of my mother's handbag before I met or even saw a black person. When I was introduced to a black academic by my father, despite lots of prepping on the way, I burst into tears and said, "You've got a black face." And he laughed a lot and said, it was a ridiculous little boy, and said, of course I got a black face because I'm black, etc. Then I started fourth grade, would it have been, in Princeton, where my father was visiting professor, and soon got to be friendly with a black boy called Marty. And I'd abandoned my name by then, and so had my brother. We'd gone back to being what we were before. And there was this very, I think, impressive conversation we had where, using the come-on line of British school children, I said, simperingly, "Would you like to come to my house for tea one day?" And he was stalling. It was very noble. He said, "I prefer coffee." And I said, "Well, it's high tea with sort of buns and cakes, sticky buns, and you can have coffee." And he said, "Nah," he said, "your mother wouldn't like me." And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "Because I'm black." And I said, and I know I said this, I don't remember saying it, but it was in my mother's diary, which I saw decades later. I said, my mother won't even notice you're black. And he came to tea, and I thought it went very well. And then I went to his place in what was then the black neighborhood in Princeton. It's now, I gather, mainly Hispanic. And I could barely cope with it, the sense of otherness, my own otherness. Really heavy, crushing self-consciousness. And I thought I was going to faint. And I wondered later whether that's what he felt at my house and what he felt on Main Street. Then I report that my father took another teaching job in America at Vanderbilt, and where he said it was the worst time of his life apart from his army service, which included the Second World War. Because at every social gathering, a professor of English would say something like, I can't find it in my heart to give a nigger or a Jew an A. A professor of English saying that. And he made the decision early on that he wasn't going to have a fight every night about this, so he just shut up. And you pay a huge psychological cost when you do that. And he said the tension of every gathering was dreadful for this reason. I end the piece by saying that this was a long time ago, and in fact one of the most marked demographic trends in America as we speak is the exodus of black families from the northern states to the southern. So something really profound must have happened over those years. But I end with Trayvon Martin, and as Edgar was saying about American law, that masterpiece of jurisprudence, stand your ground. And I asked for this reassurance at the end of the piece. Is it possible, I'm talking about equality, not about anything one would like to happen, is it possible to confess to the pursuit and murder of a unarmed white 17-year-old, and be released that evening without charge? And I wanted to be told yes. But in fact, as we all know, it's one of the public secrets of America is that this happens all the time. And as the black godfather of my first son said, who lost a brother in this way, he said, the death of a black male, a young black male, is of not much concern to the police departments of America. So it started very silly, but ended up quite serious.
Well, of course, what we all want is for America to be what we once thought it was. That's what we would all really like.
Well, what was that for you? I mean, how would you describe
What, in the
exactly
50s?
that? Or just
As a Canadian?
yeah.
The fun, exciting, progressive democracy, as opposed to the really scary stuff that was going on behind the Iron Curtain. You know, those were the oppositional things at that time. And of course, we all were very keen on freedom of expression, and we remain so, and that's why we're doing a PEN event, you know, because once upon a time, and now in lots of other countries, if you publish an opinion contrary to that of the ruling government, you get killed or put in jail. And part of what Edgar was writing about is that's now starting to happen here. And that is not our idea of what America should be at all. I think with a lot of countries, you don't ask the question, what should it be? But America has always had that question, what should it be? Because it did start as a utopian community. So it is always examining what should it be as opposed to what it is.
There have always been narratives to keep us going, however little they had to do with the actual life we were leading through our history. That there was one narrative that I was taught as a school child that we didn't really get the idea of the Constitution at the age of 7 or 8, but we had the flag up on the stage, and the colors red, white, and blue meant that we were in a country that was going to be fair to everyone, where the rich and the poor, the big and the little, and that people were coming from all over the world to live here, to get away from one kind of tyranny or another, and that the government existed for the welfare of everyone. And all of that was symbolized by the red, white, and blue. The other equally idealist narrative was that we are rightfully the best country in the world, and our hegemony is justified. Nothing has ever been as good as we are now, and the reason for that is our technological creativity, our free market philosophy, and the limited liability corporation. And both those views valued free speech, but the second view, narrative B, I would call it, worried that we were always in danger of becoming a socialist state, and the government should stay out of our business. This was a business society, and they were both idealistic views, and traditionally, historically, been argued through interpreting the Constitution. And there have been periods when we've been expansive and generous, and other periods when we've contracted and being mean-spirited and negative, and present ourselves as promoting social triage. The question is, when does either of those go over the edge, and that argument can no longer be sustained? And that's what I think we're in danger of now, that all these things have happened, and so that sacred text of the Constitution is beginning to sort of burn at the edges.
Well, I want to step back from it, from these specific essays a little bit, but keeping them in mind, because this is obviously not for any of you the first time you've entertained thoughts about America and its role and its history and its nature. And I think that in very interesting and different ways, the sort of the large presence in the world and in your own lives and your own imaginations of this very, very complicated country with its very complicated and often terrible history has come into play. So I wonder if we can sort of go back the other way now. If you can talk a little bit about the part that maybe in particular American literature has played. I mean, I know many of the writers, let's say, who influenced you were not necessarily British, but American. And I wondered sort of in earlier in your career and in your progress as a writer, what the idea or the reality of America, what kind of role it had
In literature?
in your writing, or in just
in my writing,
sort of in your.
Well, I'm not sure if this is coincidence, but when England was the center of the world in the 19th century, turn of the 20th century, it had the novels reflected that. They were huge novels about all parts of society. I'm thinking of Middlemarch and Bleak House, and they were 800 pages long and tried to be wholly inclusive of that society. And it did seem to have something to do with political power. Then England lost that power very dramatically and suddenly in the middle of the century, bankrupted by the Second World War, And as many people have written, it felt as though England had lost the war, not won it. It was a dank, a miserable place. And the center of gravity, the planetary center of gravity, had shifted to America. And with sinister instantaneity, started producing world novels. And the greatest American novel, perhaps, I think The Trail Went Cold. You know, Americans always feel they needed a great American novel to round out all the other benefits they enjoy. I mean, no one goes on about the great English novel because we, take that for granted. Although they do talk about the great Indian novel and the great Australian novel, and it's an emergent aspiration.
Kind of an upstart, post-colonial.
But there in 1953, you got what I think is the great American novel, The Adventures of Augie March. And the quest was over almost before it had begun. And then these enormous novels started appearing in America. There was Dos Passos, etc. And with a markedly Jewish cast. And that perhaps was Saul Bellow's great achievement, was that to get the Jewish voice into the mainstream. This was at a time when Lionel Trilling was turned down for a job at Harvard, I think, with a letter saying, I don't think someone of Mr. Trilling's background could be expected to understand English literature. I mean, well, we all blush about the past, but we have to acknowledge it, otherwise it rots the conscience. And there were these huge, bursting American novels that were trying to do justice to America. And America was not like England in that, as Henry James said, and I think it's the first principle you have to absorb while thinking about America, is that America is more like a world than a country. And it's nonsensical to compare what happens in Seattle to what happens in Massachusetts, and certainly what happens in Little Rock, Arkansas. They are different countries. So I was just, as I was becoming a writer, I was aware that all the ambition and all the energy seemed to be in America. And this was at a time when in England, in the 1970s, novels were about middle-class crises, and they were all 225 pages long. And I thought, I sort of fancy the American route.
And what about for, I mean, you growing up and starting to write and reading in Canada, which has its own, I think, too little known down here, very robust and rich literary tradition. But I mean, were you conscious of the United States as a kind of a literary space and as a space of the imagination, let's say, to explore, to contend with?
Very, very early, because I'm of the comic book generation. And you won't remember this, but during the war...
No, I won't. But
there were no colored comics. But right after, there was a great explosion of them, and they mostly came from the United States. And it would say at the back of the comic, these wonderful things you could collect. You could collect popsicle sticks, and you could collect, things off cigarette packages, and you could send in for wonderful things. And then it would say, offer good only in the United States. And that was American exceptionalism. And at that time, I was living at the eastern end of Lake Superior, and I could see the United States. It was a kind of fuzz, it's kind of green fuzz over there. And that was where the offer was good. You can see how it would rankle. Anyway, sure, of course, Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer were among the books that I read early on, although Huckleberry Finn is not really a children's book. Edgar Allan Poe, similarly not really a children's book, but in those days people thought if it didn't have sex in it, it was a children's book. So why was my mind warped when I was 9 by reading the collected works of Poe? Never mind. Yeah, so on through, I just read everything, and I read everything partly because I did grow up in the woods and there wasn't any television or movie theaters. So let us jump to the point at which I get to graduate school, Harvard, where they didn't hire women at that point. But they did say, you have to fill your gap. And I said, what? And they said, your gap. Your gap is American literature and civilization. So I had to go about filling my gap by studying American Puritanism, lucky me, with Perry Miller. It's actually very interesting, American Romanticism. The 18th, I actually took a course called Literature of the American Revolution, which began with the professor saying there wasn't any literature of the American Revolution because they were too busy having the revolution. So we're going to have the literature just before the revolution, and then we're going to have the literature just after the revolution. So all of that was very interesting to me, because at that point, Canada did not have a deep and rich whatever. It had a society which was constantly saying to itself, do we exist? Mm-hmm. But help is on the way, because Canada, everything is explained by Lord of the Rings. Canada has just got hold of the ring of power. Will it turn into the Dark Lord? We do not know.
You mean just now?
Yes. It's got hold of the ring of power. What is the ring of power? It's the, and this matters, which you say. It's either the tar sands or it's the oil sands. That thing, the ring of power. Beware.
I could never be afraid of Canada.
Oh, because it won't be your problem.
No, they're all very nice.
What if
there.
it goes to the dark side? What if that?
Oh, well.
You think we're all too nice, but you see, you haven't read about Gollum and what that ring of power does to him.
Well,
I'm being silly. Yeah, I'm being silly. Okay, it's all right. I'm being a bit silly.
You mentioned Poe. It's hard to imagine our literature without him, although he was really a very bad writer. And he was our greatest bad writer.
Are you going to have another fight about 19th century American literature?
No, but he was not a patriotic fellow. He had nothing but disdain for the people around him. America was booming at that time and expanding, and everyone was feeling very bullish about the country, and he ignored the whole thing. He didn't want to have anything to do with it, and possibly by way of some sort of heavenly vengeance, he was probably killed during a voting in somewhere, an election somewhere in Baltimore, and someone hit him over the head with a staff. Did I ever tell you I was named after him?
No.
Yes, I was. I mentioned this. I mentioned this before, but I think it was my father's idea. He was philosophically inclined, but he was busy supporting us during the Depression and couldn't give vent to his literary or philosophical being. But he named his child after a writer he admired. He liked a lot of bad writers, I think. But so I never thought of anything of this except when I started to write. Of course, I wrote imitation Edgar Allan Poe stories. The cell was dark and dank was one of my opening lines. And so a few years before my mother died, I finally asked the question. I said, do you realize you and Dad named me after an alcoholic, drug-addicted, delusional paranoid with strong necrophiliac tendencies? And she said, Edgar, that's not funny. I do think, of course, Mark Twain and certainly you can see the creative process not so clearly in Huckleberry Finn, but in Tom Sawyer, where Tom has an idea or a fantasy, and then it's realized later as the author figures out, oh, this is too good just to drop, I'll play it out. And you can actually see the creative process in that book. But the novel that impressed me as being nailing America is Dreiser's Sister Carrie, where people don't have any substance to them except as money supports them, as if money is the scaffold, and everyone's concerned with money. And as Carrie goes up in life, Herstwood comes down. And the critic F.O. Matheson said that the great revelation of that book, that everyone in America is either going up or going down. And it seems to me that really caught us brilliantly. But Dreiser was sort of superseded by the romantics of the self, like Fitzgerald and Hemingway, and he sort of got lost in the shuffle.
And how, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned Dreiser and that sort of that sense of scale and of the whole, you know, not just kind of individuals making their own way, but as they make their own way and as they intersect, illuminating a whole society.
Yeah, he got us all pretty well. He had everybody, every class, every upper, lower. And of course, he's a very slow, patient writer, and people think because of that is an old-fashioned quality to his stuff, because who he was reading were the Victorians, really. But he's brilliant, because everything is really balanced, and there is no faltering there. The tone is consistent, the pace is consistent. So he has a bad rap as people think he's a bad writer. He's not. He's not at all.
What would he be saying if he were with us today in 2012? Who would he be writing about?
Gee, that's a good question.
It always seemed to me that Dreiser his books consisted of a series of job interviews.
A series of what?
Job interviews.
Oh. Well,
You could make quite a
Great
good novel
American
out of a
Tragedy,
series of job interviews.
yeah,
It's a succession of job interviews.
yeah. Well, maybe, but I don't know what he would be doing now. His whole life was backwards. He started out as a fairly conservative, moralistic fellow, and as he got older and wilder, he became a communist, and he started to tell people, write letters to the president, and do all these crazy things. And I don't know what he would do.
Well, I think he would have a lot to work with. I mean, I certainly, in just being a sort of
Foreclosed homes, housing bubble, that kind of thing.
yeah, and just these kind of big, ambitious figures. I mean, just what he would do with the modern media spectacle, I think, would be
Bankers.
Yeah.
So if you were going to write the all-inclusive Victorian touches every class thing about America, what would be your 5 principal characters now, today? Where would you get them from? What walk of life?
Can I have a think about that?
No.
No.
That's a great question. But actually, I wanted to ask you to follow up about your own attraction to the American past, because it's something that's really notable in so many of your novels. You know, the March, Ragtime, most of them really. That they're kind of reconstructing or reimagining that reality as it existed in the past, maybe with some sense of a perspective on the present, or.
Well, I think all novels are about the past, actually. Some have public figures in them, some don't. I don't quite know how that happened with me, but somewhere along the line I realized that you could construct a novel out of a period of time just as you could from a sense of place. And, but I resist the label of historical novel on my work. First of all, for instance, we don't think of Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter as an historical novel, though it took place 150 years, takes place 150 years before he was born. And then we said, well, how about putting public figures in the book and setting it in the past? Is that a historical novel? Well, not really, not in any way that I could think of as an original concept. And supposing you write about the past in a very personal way, as I wrote a book called World's Fair, which is a composition based on my own family and my own childhood, but nobody knows the people in that, and it's set in the 1930s. So what's the ontological difference between that and a novel where people are known publicly? So here's the thing. We have a sense of time as flowing from the past to the present to the future. But as physicists point out, a river can flow from one point to another, but what point does time flow from? It flows from itself. So time doesn't flow. And then, of course, Einstein discovered that time was the fourth dimension, so that the whole universe is set like a big square where every event is set in place. And that's a theory of time that's called eternalism. So I don't write historical novels, I write eternalist novels.
Now, I was going to ask you a
well
similar...
Played.
Yes.
Well played. Yes.
I was going to ask you a similar question, but about the future instead of about the
Well,
the
future,
past.
the future is like the life after death. Nobody's actually been there. So you can, you can make up what you like as long as you're consistent. However, I like my future to have some relationship to the present. In other words, I'm going for a sort of very, very thin degree of plausibility, if you like.
What do you think? What do you think it allows you to
Plausibility.
do to sort of to write, kind of to speculate, to place your narratives in the future? What is it?
Why does one do it? Well, people
Yeah.
do it for various reasons. Some of them are escapist adventure reasons, and others are, this is a blueprint. This is where we are now. Here's a blueprint of where it seems that we might be going. Is this where we want to live? You know, do we want to go down that road? And with some of those roads, the best way to have people go down them is to say nothing about them. You know, don't tell. Don't ask, don't tell. But if you really don't want to go down that road, you might say, look out, this road doesn't look as if it's going to a very good place. So that's what those kinds of novels about the future are doing, and they have done them for some time.
So the idea being a kind of a warning, really.
Well, yeah, but you can't really write about the future because it doesn't exist.
Right.
Well, when
So
you
you're
write
really
about
you're writing about the present, of
Yeah,
course.
always.
You're writing about your feelings in the present, and even when you're writing about the so-called past, you're still writing about the present because somebody in the past would not have been able to see the past in that way at all.
And what about, just to complete this slightly too schematic kind of dividing you up along dimensions of time, what about the present? Because it seems to me that your novels have periodically tried to take account of the moment that that surrounds them.
I very much like Edgar's point that historical novels are about the present, and the present is an historical novel, and writing about the future is about the present, because you extrapolate trends from what you see might happen, and you explore it. And it's either a good idea and almost invariably a bad idea. Because you can't write about good ideas. But the present is very, the past does exist, the future doesn't exist, but the present doesn't really exist either, because it's in the process of turning into the past. But I would say that what has happened to the novel in the last 30, 40 years is that the pace of history has picked up. It's accelerating, and I think fiction has reflected that. Those huge, meditative, digressive novels that were in the bestseller list for months 30 or 40 years ago could not be supported by an audience today. And it's not just because people are less thoughtful, it's because people are more impatient. And the arrow of time and the arrow of development and plot is in much bolder type in the fiction of today. And it's not a bandwagon that novelists jump on, it's because they're responsive to these convulsions and sensations that we all have. And I would say that the novel is a much more sharper, pointed instrument than it used to be, and will continue. And when you're reading the New Yorker, say, or the New York Review of Books, an interminable piece about Iraq, and you see a poem at the foot of the page, you think, what's that doing there? I'm busy. Because what a poem does, particularly a lyric poem, is stop the clock. It says, right, we're going to now examine this little epiphany, and you're going to you're going to concentrate on this and see what I felt, and you say to the reader, and this, you want you to feel it too. But that's very much imperiled by this acceleration, the speed of history.
Do you think that has something to do too with the acceleration and proliferation of information? I mean, it's very interesting to me to think about the three of you, and I guess the four of us, as being creatures of print in some way, and sometimes feeling, in this very building, the rapid obsolescence of that, but following you on Twitter, as I faithfully do, but I wonder what your thoughts as writers are about the impact of that, of this new way that discourse, information, stories are being distributed and experienced, and if that, what you think the consequences of that have been or will be.
Well, when radio first came in, everybody was mesmerized by it. And in fact, Hitler probably wouldn't have been able to Hitlerify himself so much had it not been for the fact that radio was new. People were sort of glued to it. You thought that the voice coming out of it was some supernatural kind of hypnotic voice. And then we got accustomed to it. And then television hit. And in the 50s, people would gather around the television set with their TV trays, their TV dinners on their TV trays, watching the screen, just mesmerized by it. And now
Mad Magazine had a Don't Look Down TV dinner hooked over the ears and went there.
But that doesn't happen anymore. It's there. People are conscious of it. It's kind of on all the time, which is probably very bad for you. But
well, everyone
but
just has is texting.
Now right, my point. Now we're mesmerized by the shiny little screen, but that's not going to go on forever. In fact, you already are feeling some pushback and resistance to that, and people in online chats, this is why it's ironic, on an online chat, they will say, "What can I do about my internet addiction?" And there are people dealing with those questions. And there are even apps that you can get that allow you to turn it off for a
Yes,
certain
right.
amount of time. When I did put that on Twitter, and they said, "Why not just turn it off?" Why do you have to pay money to get a clock thing that tells you that you're offline for 3 hours? But there is an addictive quality to all of these things because they give you a hit of pleasurable adrenaline or whatever it is that they give you. But it's not. But the mesmerizing magic effect diminishes over time, and you find people going back to other things and making fetishes, for instance, of old black and white movies without sound, and starting to rave on about the textural qualities of the page. And now neurologists are doing work on how the brain absorbs something on the page differently from how it absorbs information on a screen.
And the brain has changed, in fact, as a result of this.
But it can change back. It's not a permanent change. It's not like being a...
But it will be a permanent change.
No, it will not be a permanent change.
But people are going to give up looking at the internet and go back to reading books.
You're not born addicted to the internet any more than you're born knowing how to read. And reading itself, let us remind ourselves, is a pretty lately come technology. The primary thing in all of that is language and story, and those are very old. But writing them down is pretty late on the timeline. How about that for a big wad of useless information?
In support of what you're saying, there was a writer, Frank Norris, American writer, and when the telegraphy came along, he thought that was the end of the world.
Yeah, sure.
Short,
Yeah, short.
10
Why have a
word
paragraph?
messages would
Yes.
destroy the
Yep.
language.
Yes.
But it is true that when we get some technology, it becomes essential, even though we didn't need it until it happened.
Well, first it becomes pleasurable. Remember the old fantasies about the automobile? It showed an empty road with you at the wheel in your shiny red convertible and the wind blowing your hair. When did that last happen to you? And
Well, thank you all. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you all for coming. And come back again.